Shadow Secretary of State for Education, which of course is a hugely important issue at all times, but in particular has been in the news recently with schools closing due to the pandemic, and clearly important for the wider economy, but perhaps more importantly for the children of our country, that those schools are back in as soon as possible. But Kate, before we get into the detail of your current brief, just give us a little bit of background on yourself, you know, where you come from and how you got involved in politics to become an MP back a decade ago now.
Yeah, it's been a quick decade and a very varied one. So people might be able to hear that I'm a Scot by birth and upbringing, although I left Scotland nearly 40 years ago, but the accent seems to have stayed with me. And yeah, the story of how I sort of got into politics, Frank, is that I'd grown up in Scotland and I moved to London for work when I was in my early 20s. And when I got to London, I was really struck by being in a city where I'd never before encountered so much wealth, and I'd never before encountered such extreme poverty. It was the first time I'd seen young people sleeping on the streets. And so I was really upset and outraged by this. And it was very clear it was the consequences of the Thatcher government's political decisions. And that drove me into the Labour Party. I was angry, I was upset. I thought, we need to make a difference here. We shouldn't accept this. I had no idea of being a politician. Nobody in my family was a politician. I didn't really know any politicians, hadn't really done student politics when I'd been at university in Scotland. But gradually I got involved in the Labour Party local to where I was living. And as is the way with the Labour Party, people who are members may recognise this. You turn up at your second meeting and you find you're the treasurer. You turn up a few months later and you find you're the secretary to the local party. And eventually, after I'd done a number of things, somebody said to me, have you ever thought of standing for Parliament? And I said, don't be ridiculous. People like me don't do something like that. But the idea sort of grew on me, and I thought, well, maybe that would be an interesting thing to do, and I'll do it once, and then I'll go back to my life and carry on, and it will have been an experience. And so I stood for election in the wonderful 1997 general election. Didn't win, one of the few Labour candidates that didn't, but I was standing in a very safe Conservative seat. But after that, I thought, this is what I want to do. This has changed everything for me. And that was really what led me to where I am now. It's taken a long time. You know, I was 50 when I was first elected to Parliament, so I've got a lot of other career experience before I ended up as an MP. But I really say two things about what got me here. I talk a lot to women who are thinking about a career in politics. And I say, you know, it's true for so many of us that what tipped us into doing this is that someone asked us to. Someone else said, you should do this. So to everybody out there, if you want to do it, go for it. And if you know someone who you think wants to go for it or should go for it, ask her to stand. Those are the two things I'd say.
Okay, good advice, I'm sure. And obviously, during that decade, you've sadly for you been in opposition, but nonetheless, you've already, prior to the education post that you've taken now, had some important roles within the shadow cabinet. First, within the Ed Miliband administration. I think, was it disability rights that you were shadow minister for then, or have I misread that?
Yeah, I was Shadow Minister for Disabled People, and I was Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, both when Ed was leader and when Jeremy was leader. When Jeremy was leader, I was in the Shadow Cabinet with that post. And you're right, I've had some amazing experiences in some of those front bench roles. So one of the things that I probably, you know, I think will leave my career in Parliament, one of having made the biggest difference was being the shadow minister when the same-sex marriage legislation went through Parliament and we passed the Same-Sex Marriage Act. And so I was the lead opposition spokesperson helping to get that legislation onto the statute book. And of course, Labour MPs, for all we were the opposition and are still the opposition, we were absolutely crucial to that legislation passing into law. More Labour MPs voted for that legislation than did Conservative MPs, without Labour MPs in Parliament, we wouldn't have same-sex marriage in law today. And so I'm immensely proud of having had the chance to be part of getting that legislation in place. It's not often MPs get to pass a law that makes people happier, but that really was a piece of legislation about rights and justice and equality. Of course it was, but it was also about love. And we don't often pass laws about love, but I'm really, really proud that that piece of legislation and the role I had in helping to get it on the statute book will go on making a difference to people's lives for generations to come.
Yeah, rightly so, to be proud of that. And of course, that would have been an issue where a free vote was instigated, wouldn't it? So it was very much a case of people voting with their consciences, and arguments happened to be made as to why it was the right thing to do. So, as you say, the opposition party was as equally important during that particular debate as the government at the time.
And what's really interesting is that it was so contentious.
Yeah.
7, 8, 9 years ago. Nobody, or almost nobody now in Parliament, would question that legislation. I think how quickly the attitude has changed, and rightly so.
It is incredible, actually. I was reflecting on this in a conversation I had with somebody that we spoke offline, somebody who Richard Angel, yesterday, who's now working at the Terence Higgins Trust. And there's a fabulous drama being on Channel 4 recently. I don't know if you've managed to catch it, Kate. It's a Sin.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the 80s. And, I was growing up in the 80s, and I look back at that time, and it's difficult to imagine living in a society with those sorts of attitudes around HIV, AIDS, and the gay community. It's just incredible the progress that's been made over the past 40 or so years. Still challenges ahead, I'm sure, but certainly that piece of legislation that you managed to help get through has been a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah, but more to do. And, we still have issues with homophobic, transphobic, bullying, abuse. There's still a lot to do to make sure that there's full equality for everyone, whatever their sexual identity.
Absolutely. So let me bring us right up to date then, and talk about the brief that you have now, because of course education, always an important issue, as I said at the outset of the conversation this morning. I should also mention today's podcast event has been sponsored by the City of Liverpool College, which is a fabulous educational establishment that, Kate, I am determined to get you through to over the next couple of years.
I can't wait to come and visit real places and real people again.
But just give us the sort of latest update in terms of where you think we are in terms of schools. Some of the issues that obviously have been discussed, digital poverty being among them, of course, but also I note this morning, back in Scotland, primary schools are reopening. So where do you think we are at this moment in time as far as England is concerned, schools returning and those other issues I've mentioned?
Yeah. So everything that I think we were thinking about in the education brief anyway has been not created by, but magnified by COVID. The access to digital resources, as you say, Frank, the free school meals issue, the exams crisis that we're facing for the second time this year after last summer's fiasco, throwing up questions that we were already asking about whether our exam system is fit for purpose, our curriculum, our support for teachers and school staff. All of these were questions that we were thinking about anyway, but COVID has absolutely magnified them, brought them into focus. And of course, the biggest concern of all is that for the last nearly 12 months now, children have suffered really serious disruption to their learning. And by not having been in class, many children perhaps have spent many, many weeks and months of the last 11 months out of the classroom. It's not just their learning that suffered, but it's their social and emotional well-being, being with their friends and peers. In some cases, it's about safeguarding, that children are safest in school, where trained professionals are able to keep an eye on what's happening to them, and there are real safeguarding issues that have been affected by children's absence. But of course, the biggest concern, I think, will be their well-being and making up their lost learning. And so I understand that everybody, and this is absolutely Labour's position, wants children back in the classroom as fast as possible. We've always said schools should be the last to close, the first to reopen. And I must say, I felt punched in the gut last March when we first saw schools closing, and children in my own constituency were crying. You know, this sense of loss and fear and total disruption to their lives was something that children felt very deeply. It's so important that we get them all back into the classroom as quickly as possible and safely. And that's why, while I think it's very interesting that the Scottish Government think they're ready to start to do that in mid-February, why I think it's the right ambition to have, as the government has, a wish to start to bring them back from early March, it's not enough just to announce a date. You need to have a plan. You need to have a plan to bring students back safely. You need to know that staff and schools have the time to prepare for all pupils to return. We need to be thinking about things like the continued access to digital resources for remote learning, because there will be children who won't be able to come back to school. They may have to isolate for a time. It may be that children will come back on a staggered basis. It may be, and I don't know why the government has ruled this out, but it may be we need to have some sort of rota arrangement to bring children back, so that some children are in part of the month and other children are in the other part of the month. We have to look at the measures that are being taken to keep schools as safe as they possibly can be. Schools have done a tremendous amount of work to make their premises COVID secure, but you know, they need support with being able to access the PPE they need. We've talked in Labour about Nightingale classrooms, so that, you know, schools can take on additional space so that they can properly socially distance. We've talked about the real importance of good, excellent ventilation. One of the key things that we need to be supporting schools to do to reduce the spread of the virus in school. But we also have to recognise, of course, that it's not just about what's happening in school, but it's the fact that transmission in the community and the interaction between the school and the community is the real concern. And that's why it's so important that in school, as well as outside of school, we have a really effective mass test, trace and isolate programme in place. And schools are supported to run those testing programmes in school. And why we in Labour have called for the vaccination of school staff to be brought forward to the February half term. So the first 4 priority groups, the most vulnerable to COVID, accounting for around 90% of the deaths, sadly, those groups should have been vaccinated by the middle of February. Tremendous achievement by our NHS and scientists and volunteers involved. After that, Labour has said, you've got the half-term window, let's vaccinate school staff, because if school staff are off sick or have long COVID or are very sick and in hospital, they can't be in the classroom, children can't be back in class. And that's why we think a very urgent step that we wish the government would take is to bring forward that programme of vaccination of school staff for that half-term week. We're talking about, although obviously a lot of schools and a lot of staff, in the scheme of the national vaccination programme, we reckon that you could vaccinate all those school staff in 1 to 2 days. So the disruption to the overall vaccination programme would be very minor. The most vulnerable will have been vaccinated by then. And the next priority absolutely has to be putting our children first, getting them back to class as swiftly as possible. And that's why we are saying bring forward that vaccination programme for teachers and school staff for half-term week.
And Kate, you be as aware as anyone as the fact that it's in deprived communities where attainment levels were already behind. And, you know, this last 9-10 months is not certainly going to do anything to help that. The digital poverty that we've spoken about is felt more acutely there. And I just wonder, you know, even if we were able to get the kids back into school post-Easter, is there now a case for a do-over year for these kids? Because, you know, I've got 2 children myself who've had intermittent periods of time off school, and obviously the close down hasn't helped in that regard, but at least they do have access to computer. You know, there are people like me who will be able to afford some private tuition to help catch up. But, you know, I do fear for those children as I say, in those deprived communities who've missed almost a year's schooling now. And I wonder whether we need to be thinking a bit more radically as to how we can help them catch up moving forward.
I do think we need to be thinking radically, and I think there are lots of different solutions and elements of a program of recovery and catch up that can't be done as a quick fix. This is a generation of children who've suffered real disruption to their learning and to their childhoods, and we have to put a big package of ongoing support around those children. They're resilient. Many kids are doing really as well as you possibly could against the backdrop of this disruption. But the uncertainty, the anxiety, the lost learning, the loss of routine, all of this we know is damaging for all children. And we have to put that right as a society and put children first. I find it incredible that, nearly a year into the pandemic, and with many children, as you say, Frank, having had to spend periods of time learning at home, we still know of hundreds of thousands of children up and down the country that don't have access to the digital resources, the laptops, the data that they need. Children still studying on their phones. I mean, that is not viable. Households where you've perhaps got 3 children and maybe mum at home working, all sharing a laptop. So children having to do their work at the wrong end of the day, that is really unforgivable. And the government absolutely needs to get its laptop program and its data arrangements in place really swiftly. It's a real failure on ministers' part that we're still in this position nearly a year after the pandemic began. I think you're right to highlight the importance of tutoring. We know a lot about how beneficial one-to-one or small group support is for enabling children to make up lost learning and to narrow that attainment gap. The government has its national tutoring programme. It's got off to a slow start. The contracts only began to go into place in the second half of last term. And although I'm pleased that more money is now announced for an expansion of that program, it's still only reaching a tiny fraction of children who we believe need to benefit from it. Only currently 1 in 6 children on free school meals. The new money announced should enable it to reach 2 in 6 of the children on free school meals. That's still an awful lot of disadvantaged children who are not going to be reached by the programme. We have to pay attention to children's mental health and well-being and their material circumstances. Children growing up in poverty, hungry children, children who are living in a home where there isn't room for them to study quietly, or where perhaps there's damp or overcrowding, that predisposes their learning to poorer outcomes. So we have to have strategies to address child poverty and enable children to thrive at home. We have to be thinking about support for teachers and education staff, because they're absolutely key to children's learning and their well-being and their ability to recover and catch up. And I know from having talked to teachers and school leaders that they have borne an incredible amount of responsibility and challenge over the last year, working flat out, going all the way back to March last year, seen holiday after holiday disrupted, by the exams debacle last summer, by the demands upon them to put in place a mass testing program over the Christmas holidays. They really are under pressure. I'm very concerned that after this pandemic, we may lose really good experienced teachers and school leaders from the profession, because they'll just think, oh, I did all that, but now I really can't carry on. So investing in support for our school staff and for the profession is a really, really important component of enabling children to recover and catch up. And I think it's also really important that we think radically, as you say. We think about things like the structure of the school day, the school year. We think about transitions from early years to school, from school to college or university. What extra support can we wrap around children as they make those transitions, because that's always a difficult time. And then you say, what about repeating years? For some children, you always have that option, and maybe it is an option for some children and young people again in this year. But I just want to be really clear that there's no silver bullet and no quick fix to addressing the challenges that children and young people have been through. We've got to be really committed as a country to doing everything to wrap ourselves around these young children, to make sure that the disruption they've suffered in the last year, and which will continue through this year and perhaps into next, that we do everything we can to mitigate that disruption at every stage of their education and as they grow up into adult life.
Now, we've, I think, quite naturally focused on schools for the early part of this conversation, but of course, the education brief is far broader than that. And sorry, you just waved to
Yeah,
some.
so Jess Phillips just walked in. First time I've seen her in weeks.
Let the audience know we are expecting a division lobby to go off at about past, so we'll crack on beyond that. But Kate, just as I say, we focused on schools, but the education brief broader than that, of course, and you will be aware that one of the biggest complaints from business for many years now has been the failure, really, of being able to create the talent, the skills that business offers is a Cinderella service, and yet it's crucially important around areas such as vocational training, apprenticeships, and I think as we start to come out of this crisis, we really do need to be investing in young people of that age.
Yeah, not just young people, actually, Frank. FE colleges and independent providers support adult learning at all ages and stages, and we're passionate about lifelong learning in the labour movement. We're particularly passionate because I think if you look forward into the workplace of the future, and particularly for young people starting out on their working lives, it's a very unpredictable environment, isn't it? Who can say what technological change or different ways of working? We've all become more used to working at home, and I think an element of that will definitely continue into the future. The workplace is changing, and people will need throughout their working lives to be able to go back and retrain and reskill as jobs we can't even imagine now become the jobs of the future, the jobs that young people of today will be doing in 30 or 40 years' time in their working lives. You're right that FE has been the Cinderella of the education system for far, far too long. The cuts in funding that it has experienced over the last decade have been appalling. 40% cuts in real terms have left FE really challenged, struggling to deliver the education and training in the skills that we as a country need if we're to rebuild after the pandemic and give every young person and adult learner the chance to make the most of their potential. The government has now announced bold ambitions for the further education and adult education sector, but the funding that's in place doesn't even fully make good the cuts that we have seen over the last 10 years. So unless these bold promises that the government is making, the rhetoric is going to be underwritten with meaningful financial support, then these are hollow promises. And we've got to be very, very serious about investing in what you say rightly is such an important sector for the future of our economy. I also think the government's being too slow. Already we have approaching 2 million working age adults unemployed. That could easily tip over 2 million by the summer. When furlough schemes end, we're obviously in a very uncertain situation where some jobs will simply have disappeared for good. And yet the programs that the government is bringing forward to reskill are too slow. They're inadequate. They're not well joined up. So you've got programs coming out of the Department for Work and Pensions, the Kickstart program, for example, not linked at all to the apprenticeship programs run by the Department for Education, not linked well to Department for Business, Energy and Innovation, which is responsible for things like the climate change agenda. Labour has said, bring forward funding now, create 400,000 good new jobs in that green economy sector and match your reskilling and training programs to deliver people now so that they can take up those good jobs. Not matched at all well to devolved authorities and metro mayors. You know, I'm an MP in Greater Manchester. We have an industrial strategy for Greater Manchester. We have a health and wellbeing strategy for Greater Manchester. We're developing an equality strategy for Greater Manchester. We should be also in the driving seat on the education and skills strategy. But again, you know, the government is treating mayors and combined authorities as poor relations in this drive for developing its programme for further and adult learning. And I think that is wrong. I do welcome what the government has said about the importance of employers as part of the strategy for skills and retraining. This has been the holy grail of post-16 education for all of my adult life, and nobody has really cracked it yet. But, you know, I think we can see that many of the things that are real problems for employers, the government has to prove that it's going to be serious about putting them right. So the apprenticeship levy, for example, hasn't worked well for small and medium-sized enterprises. I think that the idea of matching employers with colleges through chambers of commerce will work well in some areas. You know, in Greater Manchester, that's the bell. I'll just switch on mute for a moment.
Okay. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's a division bell that's happening right now in the Commons.
There'll be another one in 2 minutes, and then it will stop again. Yeah, so some chambers of commerce, like my Chamber of Commerce in Greater Manchester, are very well equipped and resourced and expert in thinking about skills strategies for the whole of our combined authority area. But other chambers of commerce, much smaller, perhaps haven't got the resources to do that. And individual employers rightly are concerned about the skills needs they have right now in their business, but they don't have the capacity to think about the long-term skills demands of the whole of a regional economy. That isn't something that you can reasonably expect lots and lots of employers to be able to do. So I think that the government has a lot of proving to do with its further and adult education strategy. We look forward to seeing the legislation that they say they will be bringing forward. We look forward even more to seeing meaningful resources for the sector. And we look forward to genuine engagement with employers, with providers and learners, and our Metro Mayors and combined authorities in equal partnership. We've got too much top-down direction again from the Department for Education, which I think we know in the Northwest really doesn't work.
You've just answered my next question, Kate, because, you know, big belief of ours as Downtown in Business, our members, and certainly as an organisation, we've been promoting the fact that combined authorities actually are the place to drive cohesion, coordination into that skills and training area, because as you rightly say, that there are gaps in terms of the provision, but equally when programmes do emerge, they often don't fit with what those local and regional needs are. So it's not just about the money, it's about the money actually being placed with the people who can best deliver. Listen, businesses are already very well engaged with combined authorities. Much easier for me to have a conversation with Andy Burnham or Steve Rotherham or Andy Street than it is with government ministers or indeed Whitehall mandarins. And anyway, you know, what Andy Street will be asking over in the West Midlands is likely to be very different to what Andy Burnham's asking in Greater Manchester.
Absolutely. And yet what we've got is a centrally prescribed list of approved priority sectors coming from the Department for Education that is meant to apply whether you're in Cornwall or you're in Cumbria. And yet the economies are very different. The Greater Manchester economy, massively different from the economy of, I don't know, Norfolk or Maidstone or, you know, what's going on in the rural southwest. So, you know, this idea of central direction, which is an obsession of the Department for Education, really, really doesn't work.
Yeah, I can't do anything other than agree. As I say, it's something we've been arguing for many years now, and hopefully there will be some movement on that. Beyond FE, of course, we've also seen some situations arise at universities, not least in Manchester, of course, around, you know, students that have felt as though they've been poorly served because, you know, they're encouraged to go back into university, and then, you know, they would suggest they were locked in. Now, we all understand and appreciate the reasons why people needed to be isolated. And we also understand and appreciate that young people were going out and were likely to potentially spread the virus. Nonetheless, I would have thought that it wasn't beyond the wit of those decision makers to see that by September, actually, we should have been saying to those students, either study from home or take a year out, because I just thought, Kate, it was premature to bring all of those people back into university at that time, and then to charge them £6,000 plus the rent and expect them to just lock themselves away in a cubbyhole. I thought it was outrageous. I really did feel for students because I felt as though they were almost blamed, and they were being blamed for a situation that was of no making of their own.
Yeah, I mean, many students have behaved incredibly responsibly throughout this pandemic. Yes, of course, we all as students wanted to go out, see friends, party, bars. But, students also work incredibly hard. Many are supporting themselves or would normally support themselves with part-time jobs. But of course, those part-time jobs, the kind they would have done in bars and restaurants, have dried up. So they're facing real financial pressures in many cases. Many are now studying at home, but you are right. In September, when they came back to campus, that's one of the many examples, I think, of the government being too slow to act, being on the back foot. And only when we began to see outbreaks on university campuses did the government start to think about strategies to get students back home safely at Christmas. And then very late in the day again to make an announcement that they should not return except for those doing practical subjects or those who really couldn't stay at home at the start of the January term. Students have suffered, their university experience over the last year has really been robbed from them. That's not all anybody's fault. The pandemic has had a devastating impact on everybody's lives, and students would not claim that they're immune from that they understand that we're all making sacrifices and people have all seen disruption to their lives. But I don't think there has been any plan, consistent, coherent plan from the government to make sure that students have been properly supported and given the best access to their education during this period of disruption. And in fact, I think in many ways, the way that they have been treated has been utterly unjust. You've touched, for example, on the fact that many of them will still be paying rent for accommodation that they've actually specifically been told they must not go back to. And the package of financial support that the government has announced in England falls way short of what, for example, the Welsh Labour government have announced in terms of hardship funding for Welsh students. I think it's also of real concern that while many universities and private providers of accommodation, student accommodation, have actually made arrangements to compensate students, to extend leases at no cost, or to refund some rent. Many students live in private accommodation, private rented accommodation, lots and lots of individual landlords. To the best of my knowledge, the government hasn't even sat round the table with landlords and student representatives and said, what's the fair way to treat these students who are paying rent for accommodation that they can't be in. I'm also hearing, I spent yesterday with my colleague Liam Byrne, who's running to be the Metropolitan Mayor there, and Emma Hardy, our Shadow Universities Minister, talking to students in the West Midlands. And they talked a lot about the kind of absence of support that they felt they were receiving to make the most of their studies in very difficult circumstances. Some still without access, again, to digital resources that they need to continue their studies, talking about the need for really good mental health support services, which were difficult to access because they're not on campus and sometimes not very well designed for the really quite intense support that they feel they need. Talking particularly disabled students about the need for extra reasonable adjustments, because the kind of learning they're having to undertake now in some ways is better for some disabled students. They may have found a crowded lecture theatre wasn't the ideal environment for their studies, but others do need extra adjustments made to enable them to learn and study and to make the most of their potential. And many disabled students talk to us about how they just felt that that wasn't really in place. And I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that not all students go off to campus to study. There are a large number of commuter students. They're often older, mature students, part-time students, perhaps combining study with family commitments, or they may still be also in employment and working and studying at the same time. And there's no package of dedicated support for them, no plan for those students. They often have made the greatest, financial sacrifices. And so they, I think, will be particularly concerned about the lack of government support for their circumstances. We have, as I was saying to you before we started the broadcasting, Frank, an urgent question in the chamber in Parliament in about an hour's time. When I'll be asking some of these questions of the university's minister. You know, what support is the government going to be putting in place for these students? Because what's been put in place so far, students are telling us really falls far short of the support that they need.
Kate, I'm going to put a final question for now to you before I bring Elaine Bowker in, who's the principal of the City of Liverpool College. Can I just, you touched on this earlier, where are we up to in terms of exams? Has a final decision been taken? And I know that, you know, this is something that's being raised, but I understand, if memory serves me correctly, decision has been taken in Wales and Scotland, but in England, are we still not any clearer of what's going to happen with the exam situation?
We're not nearly clear enough. So the government has said that A-level, GCSE and the vocational exams won't be taken this year, and there will be some kind of schools-based assessment, but we have no detail at all on what that's going to look like, although I think there is going to be some role for the exam boards in setting questions that schools will use. The government, I mean, we've been calling since way back last September for, obviously we would have liked exams to take place if that could happen fairly and safely this summer, but we also said if that can't happen, and indeed now it won't happen, where's the government's plan B? The government hasn't yet got its plan B worked out, and we are a matter now of, you know, just over one term away from those assessments having to take place, and students, their parents and teachers still don't know in detail how that's going to be carried out. Ofqual, the regulatory body, has just concluded a very, very quick consultation process that the government only asked it to start in January. And even in the 2 weeks that consultation was open, which is a very short time actually for people to put in their ideas and thoughts, even in those 2 weeks, Ofqual received tens of thousands of submissions from worried students, worried parents, worried teachers, which they're now having to sift through to come up with a robust and fair and transparent assessment process for this summer. And, you know, I think it's utterly disgraceful that here we are practically at the February half term and we still don't know what that is going to look like. I've talked to year 11 and year 13 students in my own constituency about this. I cannot convey to you the level of anxiety that they are feeling. It is so unfair to those students. They're working incredibly hard for an assessment that they still can't understand, that they can't see what it's going to be like. And the final thing I'd just say is that we need a system that can be as fair as possible to these students, that can give them the chance to show what they can do, what they have learned. But we have to recognise, of course, because of the disruption, we're also going to have to compensate as they proceed to the next stage of their studies or into work. We're going to have to compensate for the learning that they have lost. And that means it's not just about finding a way of giving them a grade this summer. It's about ongoing mitigation and support as they continue beyond their exams into the next stage of their lives, that really enables them to have every opportunity to make the most of their potential. And we also have to think about next year's exam students, because although I think exams can probably take place in summer 2022, we really do hope that we'll have broken the back of this awful pandemic by then. We have to recognise that already this year's year 10 and year 12 students are living with incredible learning disruption. So the 2022 exam series will have to be fair to the students that are taking A-levels, GCSEs and vocational and technical qualifications in summer 2022 as well.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks for that answer. And delighted to be joined by Elaine Bowker. Elaine, welcome. Nice to see you this morning. Do you want to put your comments and your question to Kate, please?
Yeah, thanks. Nice to see you, Kate, Frank. Thanks for the opportunity. Really great that you're so much ahead of this agenda, Kate. It really is inspiring and also gives me some comfort. My question in particular is about the parity of esteem that is widening between vocational, technical and academic students. And I think this is illustrated by two things that have happened, two major things that have happened, and it's a real concern for me. So the first one was the way the BTEC students were treated last summer and the fiasco and the fact that they went to the back of the clearing queue for higher education. And then the repeat of that's happened in January. So in January, I had thousands of students that turned up for their exams because they didn't get any guidance about whether they were cancelled or not. And they didn't know what their options were. But the Secretary of State felt it was important to tell us what was going to happen to A-level students in June. And I'm pleased that we got a guidance on that. But those vocational students came in to do their exams at the height of the pandemic and all the worry and the concern. Still to this day, we still don't know what's happening in terms of BTEC students. We've got the same issues with access students who are being treated really unfairly at the moment. So access students are still expected to produce 60 graded credits. They're not having any adjustments, any reduction in their workload. These are adult students holding a job down, many of them in the health service, and at the same time supporting their own children. They'll be competing with the A-level students who have had all their adjustments made. Their workload's been reduced. They're not taking the same exams, but they'll be competing with them for the same places in veterinary sciences, biological sciences, on all those hard and difficult subjects to get into. They're often students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. They're often students who are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds. They're 50% more likely to have mental health issues. I've written to the chief executive of Ascentus. He has written to QAA, and we have been told no changes, no adjustments for those students. The government just does not seem to understand what it means to be a technical and vocational student right now in this pandemic. The inequalities are just getting wider and wider. I've got over 12,000 students, 85% of them face 3 or 4 aspects of disadvantage, and I've been issued with 166 laptops. I've had to, issue thousands of laptops. So my question really, Kate.
Yeah, such a good question, Elaine. And the government talks the talk, I think, but doesn't walk the walk, doesn't put its money where its mouth is. And as you say, in terms of the decisions that it's making about exams or about resources, again and again, you see that the students taking vocational and technical qualifications are just sidelined. They're just not on the radar and treated unfairly as a result. And the government also talks the talk on widening participation and more disadvantaged students having the opportunity of a first-class education. But it doesn't deliver on that in practice. And in fact, what we're seeing, and I think this is wrong, and treating FE and HE as a zero-sum game is a mistake. I know of young people from very disadvantaged backgrounds who quite rightly aspire to a university education, and we should want any young person who can benefit from it to have the chance of getting that university education. And equally, we should be investing in and celebrating the value of the further education sector and the vocational and technical education that is on offer through our FE colleges and through independent providers, and which can lead to good and in many cases better paid jobs for young people. There are young people who've done certain apprenticeships or vocational qualifications who will end up earning more in their late 20s and 30s than some who've graduated from university in some cases. It shouldn't be a competition between the two sectors. We want students to be able to choose what's right for them, what will give them the best chance to enjoy their learning and make the most of their lives. We should enable students to swap between the two, to have much more flexibility, to build on credits that you've gained in one course, one sector, to swap into another one and return to learning and build on the learning that you've already done. Why we are so committed to lifelong learning entitlements and removing the financial barriers that people experience to taking up that learning. And I think also being really clear about, as you say, running the systems for vocational and technical qualifications, both the education and then the examination system fairly. And you pointed out some of the injustices that have been experienced by students taking VTQs last summer and again this January, and even unfairness, not just between those students and students doing A-levels and academic qualifications, but among those students, we now have some BTEC students who went back last month and took an exam. And we've got other BTEC students who went last month and were told, no, go home again. We're not going to assess you by way of an exam. We're going to do something else, but we can't tell you what. So we've got huge injustices and unfairnesses opening up among and between different groups of students. And I think it's because the government doesn't really have in its mind an understanding of what it is that these students are actually experiencing. So will drop from on high a policy statement that it wants, which may have some merit in theory. T levels would be a good example. We're going to bring in these T levels. They'll have parity of a stream with A levels. They'll give students an alternative route to concentrate on a vocational career education and career path. All of that is welcome in theory, but where has the work been done with students, with the sector, to ensure that that parity of esteem becomes a reality? Where is the work being done to ensure that, particularly in the context of a pandemic, they can be rolled out effectively? You know, they depend on work placements. What planning has gone into making sure those work placements can be provided? What's being done to ensure that we have pipelines of progression, students that can perhaps start with a traineeship or could be doing T levels, could move into an apprenticeship? Where are the joins being made to ensure that there are sensible, coherent pathways for students to learn and develop? None of that is really being put in place. And I think you're right to say that it's because the government doesn't understand, and nor really does the public understand, the vocational routes, the vocational educational routes. Somebody put it really well to me yesterday. He said, everybody can describe what you have to do to become a doctor, but nobody can describe what you need to do to become an aeronautical engineer if you're going to go the technical route. And we really need that understanding and confidence among the public, and particularly among parents, actually, that vocational and technical routes are excellent routes to make the most of your potential and to get really good jobs. And I think the government has a huge role to play in that. And its approach is far too piecemeal and too divisive when it needs to be bringing people together and giving everyone the best chance in life.
Thanks, Kate. It's good that somebody understands it in government.
Yeah. And Elaine, I was saying to Kate earlier, we'll get her along to the college and show us some of the fantastic work that you're doing with you and your team there.
Oh, great, you're very welcome. We'd
That'd
really
be great. As soon as I can set foot in a college, I'll be there.
You'd be most welcome.
Great stuff. Crossing the border from Manchester to Liverpool, but I'm sure you don't.
We're prepared to, you know, we're broad-minded. Well, you know, I'll get on the train.
Hey, that just brings me to the very final question. We've covered such a range of things this morning. I do thank you for your candour and the expertise that you brought to the conversation. But just broadening the debate, if I may, for this final 5 minutes whilst we've got you. I know you've got to dash off and, as you say, put that very important question to government ministers. But, you know, the last 10 years now, but certainly 7 at least, the Northern Powerhouse has been a thing. And I'd just love to get your take on where you see that going, what progress it's made and where it needs to continue to go if it's to have this levelling up effect that we've heard so much about. I understand and appreciate this, and nobody could have predicted the pandemic. But there is a frustration among some businesses in the North that perhaps the Northern Powerhouse is becoming a bit of a badge rather than something that's able to make a real difference to this part of the country.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't think anybody in the North quarrels with the wish to have more control over our own destiny, an ability to plan and manage our economy, our communities, to bring together, as I was saying earlier, our economic and regeneration and industrial strategies, our education and skills strategies, our health and well-being strategies, our employment strategies, our equality strategies, transport, climate, bringing all of our strategies together on that regional and super regional footprint, the northern footprint. I think everybody can see the sense of that and wants that approach to succeed. But we haven't been given, in truth, either the political capital nor the financial underpinning to be able to make that work in practice in the North. So still, investment in public infrastructure disproportionately weighted to London and the Southeast. And we need to really flip that so that we've got much, much more of the capital investment and the long-term investment in infrastructure, public infrastructure, capital infrastructure, and social infrastructure transferred into the north. We need to give meaningful political power to the north. I was talking earlier about, you know, how Mayor Andy Burnham, where I'm an MP, hasn't been given the devolved power over adult skills that would make the sense that we need to make the most of our economy and our potential for regional growth. Genuine political power, which enables decisions for our region to be taken in and by our region, I think hasn't been transferred. And I think there's a very, very big conversation to have about what kind of constitutional and political arrangements we need genuinely to transfer powers appropriately to the north. And I think business, you know, still many of our businesses are southeast of England, London based, and quite London and southeast centric. We need to offer the incentives to bring them to the north. Here's a really great example. It's Media City, just across the canal from my constituency. Once the BBC made that commitment to move to Salford Quays, we saw tremendous investment in the area. We saw families who perhaps at first weren't sure about moving north, now coming to live in Greater Manchester, many living in my constituency in Trafford, enjoying a phenomenally good quality of life, really pleased that they've made that shift. And you bring a whole new vibrancy, new creativity, new industry to the north. We need to be repeating that trick with more industry sectors, to be saying to industry, there are really good opportunities for your business and for your workforce and for families and our communities if we start to bring more of your investment into the north. So I think what we've got is a lot of enthusiasm for a northern, you know, that northern way, that coming together in the north. I regret that it may have turned out to be more of a slogan than a reality, and a real frustration about that. But now I would say, coming out of this pandemic, as we're recognizing that we're going to have to rebuild a very different kind of country from the country that we went into the pandemic with, a much more equal country that genuinely gives everybody the opportunity to make the most of their lives, that empowering the north to be in charge of its own destiny to a much greater extent must be a part of the way that we do rebuild our country in a different way. And I just think that what we've seen too often, regrettably, is standoffs between Westminster government and politicians in the north. We need to recognise that that is the most unconstructive and unhelpful way to build on the immense capacity and potential that we have in the north of our country. And as a Greater Manchester MP, I am really excited by that potential. Let's get the political, the economic, the financial and the industrial structures in place to make sure we can really make the most of it.
And Kate, on that positive note, may I thank you for joining us this morning. It's been a pleasure to get your thoughts on, as I say, a wide range of issues around the education sector and beyond. And I look forward to seeing you at a live event, hopefully in the not too distant future. It's been great to see you. Good luck with the question today. And more importantly, hopefully we get the right answers as well.
Thanks very much, Frank. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers. Thanks for everyone for joining us this morning. We do have an array of events coming up, of course, including, we've been talking about devolution this morning, the Liverpool City Region Mayor, Steve Rotherham, who joins us next week, I think on Wednesday, maybe Thursday. Check the calendar at our website, all the W's, downtownandbusiness.com, many other events as well. But finally, thanks to our sponsors this morning, City of Liverpool Business College, and of course, huge thank you to Kate Green, the Shadow Secretary for Education, for being with us today. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for listening.